We've all seen entitled behavior, but this takes it to a whole new level. A tourist at Buckingham Palace decided the rules didn't apply to her, blocking the path of marching royal guards for a photo op. What do you think happened next? If you guessed she got a polite warning, think again. This story captures the moment when entitlement meets unyielding tradition, and the result is both shocking and satisfying. You won't want to miss this collision of civilian arrogance and military discipline. Deborah Whitmore stepped off the tour bus, her designer sunglasses perched atop her perfectly coiffed hair. The air around Buckingham Palace buzzed with excitement, but Deborah's expression remained unimpressed. She'd seen grander houses back in Connecticut, or so she told herself. As she approached the palace gates, Deborah's mind wandered to her social media feed. This visit was about crafting the perfect post. Queen for a day, she mused, already imagining the likes rolling in. The crowd of tourists ahead moved slowly, their cameras clicking incessantly. Deborah felt her patience wearing thin. With a huff, she began to push her way forward, ignoring the protests of those around her. "Excuse me," she said, her tone making it clear it wasn't a request. "I need to get closer, it's important." A young couple glared as she squeezed past them. Deborah barely noticed, justifying her actions. "I paid good money for this trip," she thought. "I deserve a good view." As she neared the front of the crowd, a staff member in a red coat approached her. "Ma'am, please stay behind the barriers," he said firmly. Deborah waved him off. "Oh, I'm sure it's fine. I just need a quick photo." The staff member's expression tightened, but Deborah was already turning away. She'd read about the royal guards online, dismissing them as glorified mannequins. What Deborah didn't realize was how deeply rooted the tradition of the royal guards was in British culture. These were highly trained soldiers with a sacred duty. Their march wasn't a tourist attraction, but a centuries-old ceremony steeped in honor. As Deborah scanned the courtyard, she spotted a group of guards beginning their march. Their red uniforms and tall bearskin hats cut striking figures against the gray London sky. This was her chance. Without hesitation, Deborah ducked under the barrier rope. A gasp rose from the crowd behind her, but she paid it no mind. She was focused on getting the perfect shot, convinced that the rules didn't apply to her. "Hey!" she called out to the approaching guards. "Can you stop for a second? I just need a quick selfie." The guards didn't respond. Their eyes remained fixed ahead, their stride unbroken. Deborah frowned, unused to being ignored. She stepped closer, right into their path. "Come on, just one photo," she insisted, holding up her phone. The tension in the crowd was palpable now. People were murmuring, some in disbelief, others in anger. A child asked why the lady was being so rude. But Deborah was oblivious to it all, caught up in her own sense of importance. What she didn't realize was that her actions weren't just annoying, they were potentially dangerous. The royal guards were armed soldiers with a duty to protect the palace. By interfering with their march, Deborah was not only disrespecting centuries of tradition, but also potentially compromising security protocols. As the lead guard approached, his face remained impassive, but his eyes held a steely determination. Deborah planted her feet, convinced that he would stop or step around her. She was about to learn, in spectacular fashion, just how wrong she was. As the crowd held its breath, a gruff voice cut through the tension. "Ma'am, you need to move. Now." The words came from a man with a weathered face and a military bearing, his eyes fixed on Deborah with a mixture of concern and frustration. He stood out from the other tourists, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. Deborah turned, her designer sunglasses reflecting the veteran's stern expression. She looked him up and down, her lips curling into a dismissive smirk. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I don't recall asking for your opinion." The veteran took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Listen, these aren't actors in costumes. They're real soldiers with a job to do. You're about to make a big mistake." But Deborah wasn't having it. In her mind, she was the star of this show, and no one was going to steal her spotlight. She turned her back on the veteran, adjusting her pose as her mind raced with justifications. She'd paid good money for this trip, hadn't she? Surely that entitled her to get the perfect photo. What Deborah failed to grasp was the gravity of the situation. The Royal Guards weren't just men in fancy uniforms. They were highly trained soldiers with a sacred duty. Their march wasn't a show put on for tourists, but a centuries-old ceremony steeped in honor and tradition. The veteran, seeing his words fall on deaf ears, turned to his companion with a sigh. "Save your breath," his friend advised. "Some lessons about respect for authority have to be learned the hard way." As the sound of heavy boots striking pavement grew louder, the tension in the crowd mounted. Other tourists began to express concern for Deborah's safety, their excited chatter turning to worried whispers. "She's going to get hurt," a woman muttered, clutching her husband's arm. "Someone should do something," another tourist said, looking around nervously. But Deborah remained oblivious to the growing unease around her. She was too focused on getting the perfect shot, on crafting the perfect post that would make her followers green with envy. She didn't see the looks of concern, didn't hear the whispered warnings. In her mind, she was untouchable. A palace security officer's voice cut through the air, urgent and authoritative. "Clear the path immediately! This is your final warning!" The officer's words carried the weight of legal implications that Deborah couldn't begin to comprehend. Interfering with the Royal Guards wasn't just rude or inconsiderate. It was a punishable offense. But still, Deborah stood her ground. She'd dealt with mall cops and restaurant managers before. How different could this be? She was about to find out. The rhythmic sound of marching grew closer, a steady beat that seemed to sync with the rising tension in the air. The crowd held its collective breath, all eyes now on Deborah. She stood there, phone held high, a smile plastered on her face, completely unaware of the storm she was about to unleash. In those final moments before the guards arrived, a hush fell over the crowd. It was as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable Karen. The air crackled with tension as Guard James Windsor's unit rounded the corner, their polished boots striking the pavement in unison. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible, a mixture of awe and anticipation rippling through the onlookers. The guards' crimson uniforms blazed against the gray London sky, their bearskin hats adding an imposing height to their stature. As the guards approached, their faces remained impassive, eyes fixed straight ahead. The discipline of their movement spoke of years of rigorous training. In stark contrast, Deborah stood her ground, posture rigid with defiance. The crowd's murmurs grew urgent as the distance between Deborah and the guards shrank. Some spectators leaned forward, anticipating the collision, while others averted their eyes. Guard Windsor's mind raced, assessing the situation with practiced speed. The shoulder barge maneuver was designed for obstacles threatening their formation's integrity. As they drew nearer, tension in the air thickened. Deborah's eyes widened, uncertainty flashing across her face. Yet her grip on her phone tightened, arm extended for the perfect shot. The impact arrived swiftly. Guard Windsor executed the shoulder barge with precision, his movement forceful. The controlled collision sent Deborah reeling, her photo op dissolving into chaos. Her phone spiraled through the air, a casualty of determination. As Deborah sprawled on the ground, the guards marched on, formation unbroken. The crowd gasped, shock mingling with grudging admiration for the guards' commitment. Military historian Dr. Eleanor Fitzgerald later explained, "We witnessed a clash between centuries of military tradition and modern entitlement. The Guards' response reflected their training and the seriousness of their role." The incident served as a stark reminder that the Royal Guards are active-duty military personnel, not mere tourist attractions. As Deborah struggled to her feet, face flushed with embarrassment and indignation, reality began to sink in. The crowd's shock gave way to conversation, many shaking their heads at her actions. "I can't believe she thought she could just stand there," one onlooker muttered. Didn't she hear the warnings? Witnesses reported multiple warnings issued to Deborah to clear the path, underscoring the importance of respecting the guard's orders. As the dust settled, the full impact of Deborah's actions dawned on her. Her image of confident, globe-trotting influencer lay shattered alongside her phone. The realization that her actions had consequences beyond a ruined photo opportunity crept in, etching worry across her face. The collision with the royal guard left Deborah sprawled on the pavement. Her designer handbag spilled open and her phone skittering across the ground. As she struggled to her feet, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Her carefully curated image of a confident, globe-trotting influencer lay shattered alongside her cracked phone screen. Shock morphed into indignation. Deborah's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded, voice shrill against the crowd's murmurs. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge here. This is assault!" The gathered onlookers wore expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed amusement. Some pulled out phones, eager to capture the unfolding drama. Deborah's cries for justice were met with skepticism. "Did you see that?" Deborah appealed to a nearby tourist. "He just knocked me over." The tourist, a middle-aged woman from Australia, shook her head. "Love, they warned you at least 6 times to move," she said, her voice tinged with sympathy and exasperation. "We all heard it." As Deborah's protests grew louder, the atmosphere shifted. Many in the crowd had spent their day respectfully observing the traditions of Buckingham Palace, and Deborah's entitlement struck a sour note. A group of American college students huddled together, eyes wide. "Dude, she's gonna get arrested," one whispered. "My cousin got a citation last year for trying to make one of the guards laugh. You don't mess with these guys." The arrival of palace security and local police added tension. Their purposeful stride made it clear this was no minor incident. Deborah's indignation faltered, replaced by unease. A stern-faced police officer addressed her directly. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and listen carefully. The Royal Guards are active-duty military personnel performing their sworn duties. Interfering with their march is a serious offense." Deborah's face paled as the officer continued. "We have multiple witness statements confirming that you received no less than 6 warnings to clear the path. Your actions today could result in arrest and legal consequences." The reality dawned on Deborah. Her eyes darted around, searching for sympathy, but finding none. "This can't be happening," she thought, panic rising. "I'm Deborah Whitmore. I have millions of followers. They can't treat me like this." A palace security officer stepped forward. "This isn't an isolated incident," he explained. "We deal with dozens of cases each year where tourists interfere with the royal guards. It's a persistent issue, and one we take very seriously." As if to underscore his point, a commotion near the palace gates drew attention. Another tourist, a young man with a backpack, was being escorted away after attempting to pose for a selfie with a guard. Deborah's shoulders slumped, her facade crumbling. She looked around at the historic walls, the stoic faces of the guards, and the disapproving crowd. For perhaps the first time in her life, Deborah Whitmore felt small. The police officer placed a hand on Deborah's arm. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us. We have some questions about the incident, and we'll need to take an official statement." As Deborah was led away, the crowd dispersed. Tourists returned to sightseeing, phones filled with images of the day's unexpected drama. The royal guards resumed their duties, their disciplined march a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted moments before. As the crowd began to disperse, a figure emerged from the palace grounds, his presence commanding immediate attention. Captain Roberts, a senior officer in the Royal Guard, strode purposefully towards the scene. His crisp uniform and polished medals gleamed in the afternoon sun, a living embodiment of centuries of military tradition. Deborah Whitmore, still reeling from her encounter with the marching guards, straightened her disheveled appearance as Captain Roberts approached. She saw an opportunity to plead her case to someone who looked important. "Excuse me, sir," Deborah called out, her voice wavering between indignation and desperation. I need to speak with you about this outrageous treatment I've just experienced." Captain Roberts turned to face her, his expression calm but unyielding. "Madam," he began, his voice measured and authoritative, "I understand you've had an incident with our guards. Perhaps we should discuss this matter more privately." As they moved to a quieter area, Deborah quickly recounted her version of events. Captain Roberts listened patiently, his stoic demeanor a stark contrast to Deborah's animated gestures. When Deborah finally paused, Captain Roberts spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand something fundamental about where you are and what you've encountered today. These men are not actors in a tourist attraction. They are soldiers who have earned their positions through years of dedicated service to the crown and country." He gestured towards the palace and the guards still standing at attention. "The ceremony you witnessed is a solemn duty, a tradition that stretches back centuries. When you interfered with their march, you were obstructing active-duty military personnel in the performance of their sworn duties." As Captain Roberts explained the delicate balance between public access and security at royal sites, Deborah's earlier bravado began to crumble. The gravity of her actions sank in as he detailed the potential consequences. "Interfering with the royal guard is a serious offense that can result in arrest and legal repercussions," he said. "We've had multiple witness statements confirming that you ignored several warnings to clear the path." Deborah's mind raced back to the moments before the collision. She remembered the shouts from the crowd, the stern words from the palace security officer. In her determination to get the perfect social media shot, she had dismissed these as mere suggestions rather than urgent warnings. "But I didn't know," Deborah stammered, her voice small and uncertain. "I thought they were just—" "Just what, Mrs. Whitmore?" Captain Roberts interjected, his tone firm but not unkind. "These men are highly trained soldiers with a sacred duty. Their role in protecting the royal residences and upholding centuries of tradition is far more than a tourist attraction." As Captain Roberts spoke, Deborah felt a profound shift in her perspective. The entitlement that had fueled her actions earlier now seemed petty and embarrassing. She began to see the guards not as obstacles to her perfect vacation photo, but as dedicated professionals deserving of respect. I didn't realize," Deborah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to cause such trouble." Captain Roberts nodded, acknowledging her words. "Understanding is the first step, Mrs. Whitmore, but actions have consequences, regardless of intent." He explained that while they wouldn't be pressing charges this time, her details would be recorded and any future incidents would be treated more severely. "Consider this a learning experience," he said, "an opportunity to gain a deeper appreciation for the traditions and protocols that make this place special." As the police escorted Deborah away from the palace grounds, the weight of her actions began to sink in. The crowd that had gathered to witness the changing of the guard now watched her departure with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Deborah's face burned with embarrassment, her earlier bravado replaced by a growing sense of shame. The incident had unfolded quickly, but its effects were far-reaching. Deborah caught snippets of conversations around her. Words like entitled and disrespectful floated through the air, each one stinging like a small barb. She realized that her actions hadn't just affected her, they had cast a shadow over all tourists in the eyes of the locals. Recent studies had shown that for every widely publicized case of tourist misbehavior, there was a measurable decline in local goodwill towards visitors. One survey found that 68% of Londoners felt less welcoming towards tourists after witnessing or hearing about disruptive behavior at historical sites. Deborah now understood she had become part of that statistic. As the police car pulled away, Deborah's mind raced with the potential consequences of her actions. In today's interconnected world, news travels fast. She imagined the video of her confrontation going viral, her face plastered across social media platforms and news websites. The carefully curated image she had built online could crumble in an instant. The officer had mentioned the possibility of legal repercussions, and she knew that interfering with military personnel was no small matter. Her stomach churned at the thought of a criminal record, of explaining this to her family and friends back home. Dr. Amelia Thompson, a sociologist specializing in tourism and cultural interactions, offered insight into incidents like Deborah's. What we're seeing here is a clash between individual entitlement and deeply rooted traditions, Dr. Thompson explained. Many tourists come from cultures where questioning authority is normalized, but they fail to recognize the cultural and historical significance of ceremonies like the changing of the guard. As the police car wound its way through London's streets, Deborah found herself in an unfamiliar position of powerlessness. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she couldn't talk her way out of a situation or demand to speak to a manager. The realization was humbling, and in that moment of vulnerability, she began to reflect on her actions. She thought about the warnings she had ignored, the people she had inconvenienced, and the tradition she had disrespected. The memory of Captain Robert's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the centuries of history she had casually dismissed in her pursuit of the perfect photo op. Deborah's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. News of the incident had spread quickly, and her social media accounts were flooded with comments, few of them supportive. Friends and family were reaching out, some concerned, others clearly disappointed. In that moment, Deborah realized the true cost of her actions. It wasn't just about a ruined vacation or a potential fine. She had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the importance of cultural sensitivity and respect when traveling. As the reality of her situation sank in, Deborah felt a deep sense of regret, wishing she could turn back time and make a different choice. The clash between individual entitlement and centuries-old tradition played out in stark relief that day at Buckingham Palace. Deborah's actions, born from a misguided sense of privilege, collided spectacularly with the unwavering discipline of the royal guards. The incident served as a potent reminder of the importance of respecting cultural institutions that have stood the test of time. In the wake of Deborah's humbling experience, a question emerged. How do we balance personal desires with shared cultural heritage? As our world becomes more individualistic, her encounter challenges us to reflect. When faced with tradition, how will we respond? The answer lies in understanding and respecting the cultural significance that surrounds us, preserving the richness of our shared history for generations to come.